I wanted to ask you a few
Some
questions
questions, yeah.
about why did you decide to write about that subject?
The Windsor gathering was supposed to project unity. Instead, one private exchange shattered the calm within minutes. Camilla confronted Sophie while Catherine was elsewhere in the residence, turning a carefully controlled royal occasion into a deeply personal clash. But the true explosion came moments later, when Anne learned exactly what had been said, and made it clear that this was no ordinary disagreement she intended to overlook. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Sophie had arrived expecting restraint, not hostility. Senior members of the royal family had gathered at Windsor to ease recent tensions before forthcoming public duties, and that mattered because even private disagreements could spill into the monarchy's public work. The royal family, in this context, meant the senior relatives carrying official responsibilities on behalf of the crown. Catherine was elsewhere in the residence when Camilla approached Sophie, leaving the trusted confidant to face the queen consort alone. Camilla did not soften her words. She accused Sophie of undermining her by standing too firmly behind Catherine, and suggested that private support had started to look like deliberate opposition. Sophie felt the sting immediately, not because she feared confrontation, but because the attack questioned her loyalty after years of disciplined service. The Princess of Wales had trusted her precisely because she never treated friendship as a weapon, and Sophie knew that was now being twisted into something darker. Sophie slowly set down the glass in her hand. She refused to raise her voice, but her answer landed harder because it was calm. Supporting Catherine did not require permission. Camilla stepped closer instead of retreating. The queen consort pressed the point, asking whether Sophie's closeness to the princess had become more important than standing with the wider family. Sophie held her ground, yet the accusation left her visibly shaken. Anne noticed the change the moment she entered. The Princess Royal, a title traditionally given to the monarch's eldest daughter, watched Sophie try to dismiss the exchange and sensed that something serious had happened. She asked once. Sophie resisted. Anne asked again, this time demanding the exact words. Sophie finally repeated the accusation. Anne stopped walking. Her expression hardened, and she turned toward the adjoining room where Camilla had gone. There would be no pretending this conversation had never happened. For Anne, this was no longer bruised pride or another private rivalry. Camilla had challenged Sophie behind Catherine's back, and that crossed a line she considered personal. Anne moved toward the door, carrying all that anger with her, and Camilla had no idea how directly it was about to arrive. What made the Windsor clash dangerous was not simply what Camilla said, it was who she chose to say it to. Sophie had spent years becoming one of the monarchy's most dependable figures, while Anne had developed a fierce respect for her discipline. Catherine, meanwhile, had come to trust Sophie personally. That meant Camilla had not challenged one woman. She had pressed directly against a network of loyalties built quietly over years. Sophie understood Catherine in ways that needed little explanation. Public duty could look effortless from the outside, but the pressure behind it was relentless. Sophie never competed for attention when the Princess of Wales needed support. The monarchy's working royals are senior family members who carry engagements on behalf of the crown, and within that structure, discretion matters. Catherine valued that restraint. Sophie valued the trust. Anne respected the same quality. The Princess Royal cared less about social maneuvering than reliability, and Sophie had earned her confidence by refusing to turn tensions into gossip or leverage. That mattered, because Anne had watched too many disagreements become power contests. She believed loyalty was proven through conduct, not through declarations, and Sophie had shown that discipline repeatedly. Camilla saw something more threatening. The queen consort began to interpret Sophie's closeness to Catherine as the outline of a quiet alliance around the younger royal. The thought unsettled her, because influence inside a family can shift long before titles do. Sophie saw friendship, Camilla saw positioning, and once that suspicion took hold, every private conversation carried a different meaning. Sophie stepped into a side room after the confrontation and finally let the hurt reach her. She was not afraid of Camilla, but she was shaken that years of service had been reduced to a question of allegiance. Catherine had trusted her because she never demanded recognition. Now that same loyalty was being treated as evidence against her, and Sophie struggled to accept how quickly respect had turned into suspicion. Anne followed moments later and asked only one thing. Did Catherine know? Sophie said no. She added that she did not want the princess dragged into a dispute conducted behind her back. Anne's anger sharpened at once. Camilla had chosen a moment when Catherine was absent, removing the one person who could have challenged the accusation in real time. Anne made her decision there. Before Catherine heard another word, Camilla would explain why Sophie had been singled out when the Princess of Wales was not present to answer for herself. But Anne's fury had roots deeper than Windsor. Weeks earlier, one quiet dinner had already planted the grievance that was now beginning to explode. The Windsor attack did not come from nowhere. Weeks earlier, during a smaller royal dinner, a seemingly harmless decision created the resentment that would later explode. Nobody raised their voice that evening. No one stormed out. Yet one sentence from Sophie, followed by Catherine's quiet gratitude, left Camilla convinced that loyalties inside the family were shifting, and that she was losing influence in a room where she expected deference. Catherine had already been carrying a difficult balance between duty and endurance. Several forthcoming engagements demanded long appearances, tight schedules, and little room for recovery, which made every decision about attendance emotionally loaded. A ceremonial engagement, meaning a formal royal event built around tradition and public duty, had become the focus of one tense discussion. Camilla believed Catherine should attend. Sophie believed forcing the appearance would send the wrong message. Sophie had made her position clear before, but never aggressively. She argued that support should mean sharing burdens when necessary, not demanding symbolic displays simply to satisfy expectations. Catherine understood what she meant, and Camilla understood it too. That was exactly why the disagreement cut so deeply. The Queen Consort heard concern for the Princess of Wales and began to suspect something more dangerous beneath it: resistance. Camilla raised the issue again, at a private Windsor dinner 3 weeks before the later gathering. She proposed that Catherine personally take on the demanding engagement, despite concerns about the schedule. Sophie answered without hesitation, "Then give the engagement to me. Catherine does not have to prove anything by exhausting herself." The room went still. Catherine said nothing at first, but the meaning was unmistakable. For Sophie, the issue was protection. For Camilla, it felt like a challenge to authority itself. Catherine found Sophie afterward and thanked her quietly. She did not make a speech or dramatize the moment. She simply acknowledged that the support mattered. Camilla saw the exchange from across the room and something hardened. To her, the gratitude looked less like friendship and more like confirmation that her judgment had been publicly challenged. Camilla carried that feeling into a private conversation later that night. She asked a senior family member whether Sophie now believed she had the authority to overrule the Queen Consort. The question exposed how personal the dinner had become. Sophie never heard about that exchange, so she entered the later Windsor gathering believing the dispute had ended where it began. It had not ended. Camilla remembered every word, every pause, and Catherine's quiet thanks. When she finally found Sophie without Catherine beside her, weeks of resentment broke through. And now Anne was walking straight toward the woman she believed had deliberately engineered the confrontation. Anne did not send an aide. She did not ask for a private note to be passed later. She crossed the room herself. Camilla barely had time to compose her expression before the Princess Royal stopped directly in front of her and demanded an explanation. What followed was not a ceremonial disagreement hidden behind polished phrases. It was a family confrontation in which years of suppressed frustration suddenly became impossible to disguise. Anne found Camilla in a smaller reception room, away from the gathering and beyond the protection of polite conversation. The Princess Royal, the traditional title given to the monarch's eldest daughter, had no interest in discussing vague tensions. She repeated Sophie's account word for word and asked why the trusted confidant had been challenged personally when Catherine was not there. Camilla listened without interrupting, but her silence felt less like regret than preparation. Camilla answered sharply. She said Sophie had inserted herself into matters involving Catherine and could not object when her motives were questioned. Anne placed one hand flat against the back of a chair and told her not to disguise intimidation as protocol. That word mattered, because protocol, the formal rules that shape royal conduct and precedence, was supposed to protect order, not become a weapon in a private struggle. The Queen Consort refused to accept the accusation. Anne felt the argument harden. Camilla accused her of becoming overly protective of anyone close to Catherine, and suggested that the Princess Royal was treating her as though she had to justify her place inside the family. Anne did not rise to the insult. She returned to one point. Sophie had been confronted when Catherine was absent. That choice, she said, mattered more than rank, resentment, or wounded pride. Camilla finally stopped resisting the question. She admitted she had chosen the moment deliberately because she wanted to know whether Sophie's loyalty belonged to the wider institution or specifically to Catherine. The words landed with brutal clarity. Anne heard not a misunderstanding, but a test of allegiance. The queen consort had not simply lost her temper. She had created a situation designed to force Sophie to declare where she stood. Anne made her decision immediately. Charles would hear what had been admitted, and William would hear it too, because Catherine had been placed at the center of a confrontation she never witnessed. Camilla realized the argument had changed the moment those names were spoken. This was no longer about two women trading accusations in a private room. The motive had been exposed, and the next battle would be over who possessed the authority to decide whether the queen consort had crossed a royal line. Once Charles and William were informed, the crisis stopped being merely personal. A family argument had become a question of leadership. Could senior royals privately pressure one another over loyalty without consequence? Charles faced the most uncomfortable position of all, caught between defending his wife and protecting the cohesion of the working monarchy. William faced something different. The knowledge that Catherine had been pulled into a conflict without even being present. Anne went first to Charles and gave him the confrontation as Sophie had described it, including Camilla's admission that the timing had been deliberate. The king understood immediately why that detail mattered. The working monarchy, meaning the senior royals who carry official duties on behalf of the crown, depends on cooperation behind closed doors. If loyalty tests replace trust, every private disagreement could become a struggle over camps, influence, and obedience. Charles said nothing for several seconds. He removed his glasses, set them beside the papers in front of him, and stared down at Anne's account without speaking. The silence was not indecision, it was calculation. Any rebuke of Camilla would follow him into his marriage. Yet ignoring what she had admitted could damage confidence among the people expected to work together. Anne watched him carefully and refused to soften the point. William reacted differently when he was told. The future king focused on Catherine's absence, and on Sophie being forced to defend a relationship that should never have required explanation. He insisted that Sophie must face no social punishment, no reduced role, and no quiet exclusion for standing beside his wife. Catherine had been made the center of a confrontation she never heard, and William considered that deeply unfair. Anne proposed a boundary that was simple and unmistakable. No senior family member, she argued, should confront another over personal allegiance to Catherine, Camilla, William, or anyone else, as though the monarchy were dividing into rival sides. Charles hesitated at the language, but he could not dismiss the reasoning. Camilla had chosen her moment specifically because Catherine was not there, and that fact now carried consequences. Charles finally made the decision. Sophie would remain at Windsor, untouched by blame, while he spoke privately with Camilla. William accepted that course, though his anger remained controlled rather than settled. Anne understood why. This was no longer about winning an argument for Sophie. It was about preventing private suspicion from becoming a rule of royal life. Camilla now faced the conversation she had avoided from the beginning. For the first time that day, she would have to defend not merely what she said, but why she chose that exact moment to say it. The loudest confrontation was over, but the most painful consequence arrived in silence. Camilla returned from speaking with Charles, and immediately understood that the Windsor gathering no longer felt the same. Conversations shortened around her. Sophie remained composed. Anne stopped pretending to be neutral. And Catherine, now informed of what had happened in her absence, did something more unsettling than confront Camilla. She withheld the emotional reaction everyone expected. Charles had been firm without making the moment theatrical. He told Camilla privately that the family could not function through tests of personal allegiance, because working relationships inside the monarchy depended on trust, rather than forced declarations of loyalty. The queen consort listened as the king made another point equally clear. Sophie would not be required to apologize. That mattered because there would be no convenient solution in which both women were blamed equally, and the deeper issue quietly disappeared. Camilla remained alone after Charles left. She sat for several minutes with the weight of the conversation settling around her. wounded less by public embarrassment than by the knowledge that her husband had refused to defend the confrontation itself. An aide eventually entered and asked whether she intended to return to the gathering. The queen did not answer immediately. When she finally said yes, the word came slowly, as though returning now required more courage than leaving. Catherine reacted very differently when Sophie told her what had happened. The Princess of Wales did not explode. She felt guilty. Her first concern was that Sophie had been placed in the middle of tension surrounding her, despite never asking to become part of anyone's struggle for influence. The trusted confidant tried to reassure her, but Catherine pressed gently, wanting to know whether Camilla had threatened her future duties or position. Sophie answered no, then shared the detail that changed the mood again. Camilla had asked whether she would stand with Catherine if divisions inside the family deepened. The queen consort had not threatened a title or responsibility, but the question suggested something more disturbing. She had imagined the possibility of rival camps before anyone else had openly described them. William heard the wording and immediately understood its danger. Anne did too. The prince saw Catherine being turned into the center of a faction she had never created, while the Princess Royal heard proof that Camilla's confrontation had gone beyond one bruised disagreement. Catherine made her decision quietly. She needed to speak with Sophie alone, without William, Anne, Charles, or any palace structure between them. The Windsor crisis would finally turn when she closed the door behind the trusted confidant and stripped the conflict down to two women, one friendship, and the true cost of loyalty. There was no audience when the conversation took place. Catherine and Sophie sat alone, without Anne, William, Charles, Camilla, or aides. For the first time since the confrontation, Sophie stopped speaking like a senior royal managing a crisis. She admitted the accusation had hurt. Catherine responded with something even more revealing. She never wanted loyalty to her, to become a test anyone else had to survive. Catherine asked Sophie to tell her everything again, not for an official record, but because she wanted to understand how the confrontation felt. The Princess of Wales listened without interrupting as Sophie described the accusation, the deliberate timing, and the demand that she define where her loyalty belonged. A private secretary is a senior aide who helps manage a royal's official work, but none were present now. Catherine wanted no filter between them. Sophie explained that the earlier dinner had never been about choosing sides. She had defended Catherine because she believed it was simply decent to protect someone from unnecessary strain. The trusted confidant said she had never imagined that one sentence would become evidence of a faction. Catherine heard the pain beneath the calm, and that mattered because Sophie was usually the person who absorbed pressure without asking anyone to notice. Catherine reached for Sophie's hand and apologized that standing beside her had created consequences. Sophie stopped her immediately. She told Catherine not to carry responsibility for another person's choice. Yet the hurt remained. Sophie admitted she had considered stepping back from private family discussions altogether, hoping distance might remove her from the tension. Catherine refused. She told her not to disappear because someone else had made loyalty dangerous. Catherine then made her own position clear. She intended to speak with Charles and tell him she would not accept a royal environment where people were pushed to prove whether they were with one woman or another. The king would hear it from her personally, not through William, Anne, or palace channels. Sophie agreed with the principle, but asked for restraint. Camilla should face accountability, she said, not humiliation. Sophie's request changed the emotional direction of the crisis. Catherine understood that revenge would only confirm the very divisions they were trying to reject. A boundary could protect people, humiliation would create another wound. That distinction gave Charles and Anne a path toward resolution, without forcing Sophie to become the symbol of a larger family war. Catherine left that private conversation with quiet resolve instead of anger. Sophie left knowing she would not retreat. But Windsor could not contain what had happened forever, and once the confrontation reached the public, one image would come to define the entire scandal. By the following morning, the Windsor clash had escaped the private rooms where everyone hoped it might remain contained. In this dramatized account, the story was no longer about an awkward royal disagreement. It had become a national argument over loyalty, female power, Catherine's influence, and whether Camilla had tried to pressure Sophie for standing too close to the Princess of Wales. Then one newspaper front page turned the entire dispute into a single unforgettable symbol. Royal correspondence moved quickly. They focused less on Sophie's original disagreement with Camilla and more on Anne's furious intervention, presenting the Princess Royal as the family member who had refused to tolerate pressure behind closed doors. Palace communications stayed deliberately restrained. That term refers to the official messaging used to explain royal events and protect institutional stability. The brief response described the Windsor gathering as private and refused to detail the conversations that had taken place. One London morning paper pushed the drama further. Its front page showed Anne and Sophie leaving Windsor within minutes of each other, beneath the fictional headline, "Loyalty Line at Windsor." The accompanying account called their departure the defining moment of the gathering. Sophie suddenly found herself praised for refusing to retreat, while Anne became the symbol of a boundary the public believed someone inside the family had finally been willing to enforce. Outside Windsor Castle, the reaction became impossible to ignore. A small crowd gathered near the public approach, some defending Sophie, and others insisting that private royal arguments should never become national entertainment. Catherine remained silent publicly, but her absence from the argument itself became part of the debate. The more people discussed her, the stranger the original confrontation seemed. She had become the center of a loyalty battle without being present when it began. Broadcasters soon concentrated on Camilla's supposed loyalty test, rather than the ceremonial disagreement that started everything. Charles understood the danger immediately. The king knew that if the language of rival camps took hold, every future disagreement could be interpreted as evidence of a divided monarchy. Sophie's private pain had now become an institutional problem, while Camilla's attempt to question allegiance had created exactly the public division everyone feared. Charles responded with a firm internal understanding. Family members could disagree over duties, schedules, and responsibilities, but nobody would be challenged over personal loyalty to another royal. Anne had wanted that boundary from the beginning, and Catherine supported it without demanding humiliation. The public storm had forced Windsor to define the principle at the heart of the crisis. Now only the final reckoning remained. Not who had won, but what Camilla, Sophie, Catherine, and Anne would each have to accept when the anger finally gave way to consequence. In the end, Windsor did not produce a dramatic exile, a stripped title, or an irreparable family rupture. It produced something more consequential, a boundary. Camilla learned that rank could not be used to interrogate another royal's personal loyalty. Sophie discovered that quiet support did not make her weak. Catherine refused to turn the episode into revenge. And Anne, after all the fury, proved that her anger had never been about winning. Charles closed the matter privately. He made clear that future disagreements over responsibilities had to remain focused on duties and service, not on personal allegiance between individual members of the royal family. The king understood why the distinction mattered. Once private loyalty became something to be tested, cooperation would collapse into suspicion. Sophie returned to her normal responsibilities without apology or any reduction in standing. She had defended Catherine, but nobody could claim that compassion toward the Princess of Wales amounted to disloyalty to the crown. The trusted confidant carried hurt from Windsor, yet she also carried proof that refusing intimidation had not cost her place. Her quiet steadiness had survived the storm. Anne found Sophie before she left Windsor, and spoke without the fury that had defined the confrontation. The Princess Royal told her she had been right not to surrender her principles, simply to keep the room comfortable. Sophie answered that she had never wanted Anne fighting a battle on her behalf. Anne paused, then replied that some battles become larger than the person who starts them. Sophie had no answer. Catherine later spoke directly with Camilla, and kept the exchange simple. The Princess of Wales did not demand public submission, or an apology performed for appearances. She told the Queen Consort that Sophie must never again be placed between them. Camilla accepted the boundary because she could now see the cost of challenging loyalty. Instead of isolating Sophie, she had exposed how much trust the woman held among Anne, Catherine, William, and Charles. Anne stepped back once the principle was secure. Continuing would have turned protection into vengeance, and neither Sophie nor Catherine wanted that. The anger had done its work. Camilla was chastened, Sophie remained respected, Catherine refused to weaponize the outcome, and Charles preserved a boundary the family could live with. There was no unfinished battle left at Windsor. Camilla's challenge failed, Sophie's loyalty survived intact. Catherine chose restraint over retaliation, and Anne's fury established the line that finally ended the confrontation. Windsor had tested them all, but its final verdict was unmistakable. Authority without trust weakens a family, while loyalty freely given can survive even its most painful challenge. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.